Namaste everyone, welcome to our Endgame series. Today we will be analyzing a game that was played in 2006 between Gata Kamsky and Etienne Bacrot in MTel Masters. The game features a Rook and a Knight endgame. As we have seen in the previous lessons that Rook and Knight endgames where the Knight and the King are on the edge of the board are mostly drawn. But Kamsky was able to win this endgame and we will see what went wrong and how he was able to win this endgame. In this position, the pawn has to be promoted into a knight. Otherwise, Rook h1 will be a checkmate. So pawn e1, knight check and king g3, knight d3, rook d2 and knight e1. Bacrot brings the knight back to e1 to keep the knight and the king together, as we have learned in the endgame. Kamsky continues with the rook f2 check, king g1 and rook f8. Now again knight g2, keeping the knight and the king together. Here king f3 and king f1. This king f1 is a losing move. What Bacrot had to do in this endgame in order to draw is play knight h4 check. If king g3 and then knight g2, and this is again the same position, and this will be repeated. And if king goes to e2, then king g2, rook g8 check, king h2, king f2, and king h3. And again, this is the same position, except this rook is on g8 instead of g1. So after, let's say, rook g1, this is again the same position, and it will be again a draw. For example, knight f5, g5, and knight e4, again repeating the position. But when Bacrot played king f1, this becomes a losing position. And Kamsky was able to figure out and plays the move rook f7. Now this move is winning because if the king moves, then the knight will be lost. If even, then king will capture, and if g1, then rook g7 will pin the knight and will win the knight. So knight has to be moved, and if knight h4 check, then king g4 will win the knight. Knight can also not go to e3 and f4 squares, so knight e1 check, the only move. King e3 with check, king g1, king e2 attacking the knight, and knight g2, again keeping the knight and the king together. Rook comes to h file to prevent these pieces from coming onto the h file, because then as we have seen, this will be a draw. So rook h7, knight f4 check, king f3 and knight d3, and rook h5, controlling a lot of squares from the knight. And if knight goes to even check, king e2, knight g2, again bringing the knight and the king together, then white can play this rook e5. And again, if knight e4 check, king e3, knight d3, then rook e3. This will prevent the knight from coming back to the king. And now the knight will have to move away from the king to either b4 or c5. Knight cannot go to c1 or b2 squares, because then rook will check and win the knight. For example, c1, then rook even check, king h2, and rook will capture. So after rook e3, this knight will have to go to either b4 or c3 and move further away from the king. And we have seen in the previous endgames that when the knight is too far away from the king, the opposing rook and the king will be able to trap the knight. And this is how Kamsky was able to win this game.